Welcome back to the channel, and in this video we're going to be covering the Florida Gators. Florida Gators had their very first season under Billy Napier last year. Before the season started in the summer, I had Florida going 6-6. Well, they went 6-6, but it was still a disappointment last year. Now, why would that be a disappointment if they literally matched the record that I thought they would do? It was because of this. When I made that prediction of Florida going 6-6, this was what I thought. Lose to Utah, lose to Kentucky, beat USF, lose to Tennessee, beat Eastern Washington and Missouri, then lose to LSU, lose to Georgia, lose at Texas A&M, but win your final three games of the year: South Carolina, Vanderbilt, Florida State. Well, they beat Utah, which was not something I did not expect them to do, and the game that was probably Anthony Richardson's best game as a Florida Gator ever. It was by far the best game of his career at Florida, and it was certainly Florida's best win of the year last year. But they fell off the very next week when by losing at home to Kentucky. And watching that game, it felt like Florida had a chance to win that because the Kentucky won, but it felt like Florida just the offense just kind of handed the game to Kentucky because Kentucky had a touchdown on a pick six. Kentucky had another touchdown drive where they had a very short field because Anthony Richardson threw a bad interception. So two bad interceptions so basically awarded Kentucky 14 points, and then a couple other field goals that Kentucky added was because Florida went for it on fourth down inside their own territory to try to come back and win the game, and it allowed Kentucky to add six more points. Outside of the play action pass that Will Levis threw on the touchdown, on his only touchdown pass of the game, that was really the only play on Kentucky's offense where where you could say that they marched down the field and actually scored a touchdown. Like the rest of it seemed like it was just more so by bad ball security by the Florida offense because I don't think Florida's defense was the issue in that game. Excuse me, water break. Sorry if you heard that. Then the very next week, they had by far what was their worst performance of the regular season, and that was barely beating a terrible USF Bulls team last year. Like I was not pleased, even though they won, I was not pleased with the fact that had to win by 3 points, and it came down to USF missing a field goal to keep the game from going to overtime, in which Florida would have, in my opinion, probably would have lost it in overtime. And losing to USF, in my opinion, would have been on the level of losing to Georgia Southern because USF was terrible last year, and they've been a terrible program for about 3 seasons now, even for by Group of Five standards. Then after that loss, they go on the road at at Tennessee, and they held their own in this game. Like they actually was a little bit more competitive than what I thought they would be in this game. Tennessee, who wound up having the best year that they had since 2007, going 11-2, winning an Orange Bowl, beating Florida and Alabama for the first time since 2004. But Florida held their own in this game, and they were actually, even though Tennessee, I made that mistake again. Tennessee was up by 12 points in the fourth quarter. Florida kind of made it closer again towards the end, and they actually had a chance to possibly have a game-winning score at the end of the game when they were down by five. But all in all, Tennessee won. Congratulations to them. Florida bounces back with a couple of victories against Eastern Washington and Missouri. Missouri, the offense to me was actually almost as bad as they were against against Kentucky as they were in the Missouri game. They did not perform well whatsoever. The defense really held their own. It really had to carry that team in that victory. Then they lose on their homecoming weekend to LSU. They have a bye week. They get blown up by Georgia. But the good news is that they didn't quit in that game because they were down 28-3 at halftime. But then at the end of the third quarter, they were down 28-20. So they outscored Georgia, who went on to win the national championship, 17-0 in that third quarter. So that was a good sign that they were not quitting on the first year staff so soon. They go on the road and beat Texas A&M, and I thought it was a must-win game for both Texas A&M and Florida in that game because Texas A&M at the time was sputtering. Their season was spiraling out of control. They were one of the most disappointing teams of 2022 season, losing to Appalachian State, having the best class in the nation per recruiting evaluation sites last year, and they were just awful throughout that whole year. And heading into this game, Texas A&M was down by excuse me, had 30 players out due to illness. So I thought it was a must win for Florida because you don't want to head into your final 3 games on a 3 game losing streak because then you're wondering if your players are even going to be motivated at all to finish the year. But luckily for Napier and the staff, they went on the road at Texas A&M. And then came what I would call the make or break game of last year because they absolutely boat raced South Carolina. They dominated South Carolina. They had a 21-0 lead after the end of the first quarter. Uh, Anthony Richardson and the offense drove down the field, scored a couple of touchdowns, and then Trevor Etienne one of the had one of the best touchdown runs of college football last year, 85-yard touchdown run, and to put Florida up 21-0. And Florida continued that momentum throughout the rest of the game. Although I do kind of think Florida could have played a little bit better in that second half, no matter what the final score says, 38-6. But that the saddest part about that victory is that that was Florida's peak because they beat South Carolina the way that they did, and then they just absolutely plummet. You see it on the screen. 3 game losing streak to end the year. They lose on the road to Vanderbilt. I don't care if it was Billy Napier's first year or not. There is no excuse for losing to the Vanderbilt Commodores. I don't care if you are a first year head coach. And by that loss, Billy Napier became the first Florida Gator head coach, first football coach in the history of the Florida Gators program to lose to Tennessee, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt all in the same year since I think it was like the 1950s or the 1940s. One of those 2 decades. No excuse. I absolutely ripped the staff for how the team played last year on the road at Vanderbilt. That victory could have given them a 7 win season, winning year after they had won 6 and 7 just the year before, and then they go on the road at Florida State. And Florida played well in that first half. They were up 24-21. They were on the road. Florida State had all this momentum riding for them for the season that they had because they exceeded expectations so greatly last year that if you had went on the road and beat Florida State, I actually would have rated that above the Utah game because at least the Utah game it was week one, so uh, it was week one in which a lot of teams were trying to figure out what kind of a team that they were going to have throughout the season. So, but in this case, it was the last game of the year, and Florida State had all this momentum. That would have been your best victory of the entire year. And Florida was up 24-21 at the start of the third quarter, but they allowed Florida State to score 17 unanswered points in the third quarter, and Florida had to almost had to pull off the comeback of comebacks to try to get the game to overtime, but it was far too late. The Seminoles won 45-38. They had a chance to win that game and head in and end the year strong, beating your in-state rival, killing the momentum that they had, and it was just a heartbreaking loss for Florida fans. And then in the Las Vegas Bowl, they were absolutely drubbed by Oregon State. Oregon State was one of the most underappreciated teams of the year last year, going 10-3 when nobody expected them to. And what was a very good year for the Pac-12 conference. There was a lot of good teams in there: Oregon State, UCLA, Utah, USC, Washington State, an improved Washington State and Arizona team. There was just there was actually some really good football that was played in that conference last year. And I know Florida had a lot of players that were out because they entered the transfer portal. They're preparing for the draft, and I didn't expect Florida to beat Oregon State, but at the very least, 30-3. Can you at least do better than that? At least score one touchdown. If it was like 30-14, I could live with that. But 30-3, that was a terrible performance by Florida, even with all the circumstances that I had already brought up. So and then, of course, things did not go well for Florida towards the end of the calendar year because of the whole Jaden Rashada scandal. So the optics for the Gators program was just really, 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 really low. But that was last year. This year's this year, and this is Florida's 2023 schedule, and they're going to start on the road at Utah. I think Utah's going to win this one. Granted, I thought they were going to win last year, and Florida didn't. But the difference is Florida's on the road, Utah's at home. And the home field advantage that Florida had last year of the weather and the humidity, being that they're a Florida team, they were already used to it, while Utah, more of a cold weather state, they were trying to get used to that weather themselves, and it kind of affected the Utah squad. I remember rewatching it recently, and there was some Utah players vomiting. There were some Utah players cramping up. There were some Utah players feeling dehydrated at the end of the game because the humidity took a lot out of them. This time, not only will Florida be on the road to deal with that crowd noise, another big factor is the altitude. Utah, the state of Utah is 6,000 feet above sea level. That's higher than the city of Denver, which is known as the Mile High City. That's big because the state of Florida, the entire state of Florida is only a few hundred feet above sea level. So higher altitude means less oxygen. So cardio and conditioning is going to be a major factor for Florida heading into this game, especially being that it's an unfamiliar uh, opponent in unfamiliar territory, being the fact that the Gators have not played uh, road game outside the state of Florida, outside the conference, since the mid 90s. It's been a long time since they did that. So Billy Napier, I really hope he had a game plan to prepare for that altitude, get the players well conditioned, and get the players ready to deal with that crowd noise. So I don't have Florida winning this game. I think Utah takes it. I think Florida will win their home opener against McNeese. I'm not going to give them too much coverage. I don't have them beating Tennessee. Now, Tennessee, I don't think they'll be as good as they were last year because I think they're going to really miss Hendon Hooker and they're going to really miss some of the receivers that they lost to the draft. Cedric Tillman and Jalen Hyatt being the two biggest names of that bunch. But I'm not a fan of Joe Milton, their quarterback, Tennessee's quarterback. I don't think he's really that good. I mean, he had a good performance against Clemson, but the guy isn't accurate. He has a cannon of an arm, but he can't hit the broadside of a barn. Um, and he does not have tremendous athleticism that Hendon Hooker had. Hendon Hooker what had great quarterback instincts, great quarterback accuracy, pocket awareness, and good athleticism. Mackenzie Milton doesn't really have that, in my opinion. So I'm going to give Tennessee a victory there, and it will be the first time Tennessee um, wins on the road in the swamp since 2004. The very next game, Florida will play the Charlotte 49ers. I'm not going to give too much of an analysis on that game. Florida has no excuse to lose that game whatsoever. Next week, the very next week, they're going to be on the road at Kentucky, and I think Florida can go on the road and beat Kentucky. Kentucky lost some good players to the draft, lost some good players to the transfer portal. Devin Leary, they transferred in from North Carolina State, and I think he's better than Will Levis, but Devin Leary um, has durability issues, and he just for some reason doesn't know how to, get his team above the hump in order to get some big wins because he had some good teams at North Carolina State, but for some reason he could just never, you know, get that string together multiple big wins together that could have really put North Carolina State in contention for the ACC title. But I think Florida can go on the road and beat Kentucky. I don't think Kentucky's going to be that good this year. They lost a lot of good players on both sides of the ball. They lost some good linebackers and some good running backs, and I think Florida will can go on the road and beat them. Uh, Florida, if Billy Napier, if Billy Napier loses to Vanderbilt, uh, then whoever believes that Florida should get rid of Billy Napier, I will never argue with you again about that. It's bad enough you lost to Vanderbilt once. You lose to them twice. You should not be the head coach of the Florida Gators. So Florida, um, if I was Billy Napier, I would make sure that his guys were pumped up to play Vanderbilt because they were absolutely embarrassed by Vanderbilt last year. It's a homecoming week for Florida, so that's going to be even more motivation, I think. The crowds at Florida on homecoming week are jam packed, and I think Florida needs to go out there and not just beat Vanderbilt, but dominate them and show, okay, this is how we need to be playing Vanderbilt every single time they come around. On the road, then they're going to be on the road next week at South Carolina. There's a little bit of a gamble here, but I'm going to say Florida can win on the road at South Carolina. South Carolina kind of has the same factors in their favor that Florida had last year. In 2021, South Carolina blew out Florida 40-17, and then the very next year, Florida not only had revenge on their mind for getting embarrassed the way that they did, but the fact that they were at home. Both of those factors are in favor of the Gamecocks as well. So I think South Carolina is going to have this game circled in red, and I think it's very important for Florida to go on the road and get this victory heading into their game against Georgia a couple of weeks later. They have a bye week after South Carolina, but after their bye week, it's going to be a murderous road because you play Georgia, then you're on the road at LSU, and then you're at home against Florida State, who appears to have getting ready to have a pretty good season again, like they did last year, and then you got Missouri and Arkansas in between those three games. Missouri game being on the road. Uh, I'm going to say Florida wins at South Carolina. I don't have Florida beating Georgia. They're just not at Georgia's level right now. It, I would love for that to happen, but I just don't see it happening. I think Florida loses to Georgia. I think Florida can beat Arkansas. I don't think Arkansas is going to be a good team this upcoming year. And then they're going to be on the road at LSU. LSU is one of the toughest road venues to play at for any team in the nation. Doesn't matter if you're Florida, Alabama, Ohio State, or whoever. Death Valley is all and Death Valley is always a hard place to play at, and the fact that Florida is going to be on the road to play LSU, uh, that's just a tough matchup for the Gators. And then they're going to be on the run at Missouri. I'm not a fan of the Missouri's head coach Eli Drinkwitz. I respect Missouri's defense and their defensive staff. They were top 25 nationally in defense last year, but I just don't think Missouri will be a good team this year. I think Florida can beat Missouri, and then I have Florida losing to Florida State. State had a good year last year, and they added to it with the transfer portal additions that they made. Jaheim Bell and Keon Coleman from Michigan State. Their wide receiving core right now is starting to look pretty darn good. Full of guys that are 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", so a lot of jump balls are going to be thrown uh, to the Florida State receivers this year. Jordan Travis has gotten better every single year that he's played at Florida State, and Mike Norvell has that program giving that program some newfound confidence that they have not had in quite a long time. So that's going to be my record prediction for Florida. Lose to Utah, lose to Tennessee, lose to Georgia, lose to LSU, lose to Florida State. 7-5 record. Um, I think Florida really needs a winning record this year because that would be three consecutive losing records um, for the Florida Gators if they don't make a bowl game or they win 6 games but they lose their bowl game again. Um, I think Billy Napier really could use uh, a good season this year just to kind of get some of the heat off his back. And while I understand being at Florida, uh, it's a pressure cooker of a job, but you know, it's just I think people really need to give him some time to change the direction of the Florida team. I'm not ready to quit on Billy Napier yet, but I think he really needs this year, and hopefully he can keep that recruiting class together. So that's my recommendation for Florida, 7-5.